Hi, good evening. Okay, I'll send this out, the recording out tomorrow to everybody on the list, and I hope everybody's doing well. These are, of course, difficult times, and in case you haven't noticed, the last Breshit, Noah, Lech Lecha, Ve'era, and now here in Chayei Sarah, I'm emphasizing Eretz Yisrael issues. And this week's parsha, of course, begins with one of the most famous stories about our connection to Eretz Yisrael. And of course, that is when Avraham Avinu makes the first purchase of land in Eretz Yisrael to have an achuzat kever. We'll talk more about that terminology in just a couple of minutes. To have a permanent possession of a piece of land for a kever, for a sepulcher, for a tomb, grave, for his beloved wife.
Okay.
Hi, Rona. For a minute, you're going to be on the recording. I just pinned myself now. Erev Tov.
Is there anybody else? Just me again?
Yeah. No. Last week somebody else joined, but I'll do the recording and I'll send it out. I got a few thanks from people for the recording.
If you don't mind,
good to have you.
I will join. I will listen to the recording.
Whatever you prefer. Yeah. Oh, hi, Jean.
Because I've kind of had drops in my eyes. I had an op on my eye last week, and it's.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Okay, so thank you.
You know what? I think what I'm going to. Okay. It'll be on sometime early tomorrow morning. Okay.
Great. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Okay. Bye, Rona. Hi, Jean. I like your background.
Oh, I know. My grandson's bedroom.
The appropriate background. Okay, I'm saying that as if anyone who's listening to the recording can see the background, but she's sitting in front of an Israeli flag, and she's framed by the two blue stripes. It's beautiful. So again, what we're seeing now, and as we are emphasizing Zionist topics and issues during these weeks and during this difficult time, this week we do record the first time that a Jew owned land, purchased land, possessed land in Eretz Yisrael. And that's a very special thing. And we don't want to minimize that, but let's look at the story. And the story really spent a lot of energy on how significant this event was. And the pasuk I want to start with is the pasuk that states that the land became the property of Avraham Avinu. And that pasuk, which is chapter 23, verse 17, Yokam Sede Ephron, and the land of Ephron, which was in this place called Machpela, which was near this place called Mamre, the field with its cave, V'amara asher bo, v'kol ha'etz, and all the trees that were in this field, asher b'chol gvulo saviv, which were contained by the boundaries of this Yokum. Now, Yokum does not mean past. When the Hebrew in front of me, which is the JPS translation, Jewish Publication Society, says past, Yokum literally means it rose. And we're going to, in about, I'm going to say 15 minutes, return to that idea about the elevation, the raising of the land. But Rashi is going to look at it a little bit differently from what's going to be our final approach. But Rashi commenting again on that expression, Vayakom Sde Ephron, and the field of Ephron, and then this very detailed description of that area which was purchased. It's interesting. In Judaism, we like to be very specific about locations. Even when we read like a ketubah at a wedding, we're supposed to specify exactly the location and put it in terms of something nearby. Now, as we can say, Yerushalayim in Eretz Israel, or we can say New York City in Tzfon America, in North America. Or some people want to use some geographic location. Rav Soloveitchik said if you're getting married in Manhattan, you should mention by the Hudson River, by Nahar Hudson. That we want to be very specific about locations. But Rashi's not talking about that. He says, and the field of Ephraim was made sure. Literally, it rose. It received a rise, an elevation in importance, because it passed from the possession of the first translation is commoner. The Hebrew hedjot doesn't mean, isn't a bad word. It just means like a normal person, as opposed to somebody who is special, who has some sort of position, into the possession of a king. Avraham Avinu has the category, has the status of royalty. But the real meaning of the verse is the fields in the cave that was in, and all the trees became secured to Avram as a possession. That it's nice to say that it rose, and we're going to return to that idea. It rose in spiritual stature or in importance, and we'll talk a lot more about that a little bit later. But Rashi wants us to know that the literal, most important meaning is that Avraham Avinu became the possessor of land. Okay. The Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, writing around the same time as Rashi, actually slightly later, writes about this idea. Asher lifnei mamre hasadeh v'amara. He's more concerned with a little bit of geography. Both were outside the actual town limits of Kiryat Arba. This is fascinating because he's not correct. He's assuming that the field and all of that was outside the city. But when you go to Cave of Machpela, and I assume Rabbi David Kimchi, who spent most of his life in Spain, never went, it is within the boundaries of the city. But okay. The present day Hebron then having been known as Mamre. So he's more concerned with the changing of the names of the community. The Torah makes certain that all the names by which location has ever been known is mentioned so that no one in the future could challenge this cave as belonging to the Jewish people. No one could challenge. We're going to return to that idea that no one could ever question the Jews' right to Eretz Israel, right? God forbid someone would say, oh, the Jews don't belong there. Right, that of course happens all the time. But what are you going to do? The Or HaChaim, who did make Aliyah and did for a short time actually live in Hebron. He eventually dies in Yerushalayim, but he spent some time living nearby in the same area as Martha Machpelah. Sages comment that a sinner causes his head to be bowed down, lowered as a result of his sins. Evil is defined as something which causes man to look only at what is below him. One of the Psalms that we are reciting during these difficult times is Sher HaMalot Mima'amakim, out of the depths I am calling to you, that I feel in the depths of maybe it's sin, maybe it's depression, maybe it's other types of difficulties, but we refer to being in a bad way as being low. Obviously, in English too, I feel low. Evils don't have something causes men to look it up at the ground, whereas Kedusha, sanctity, results in raising up one's head and elevating a person spiritually. We note that the Torah describes even the cave of Machpelah as undergoing an elevation. So in other words, its former status when owned by Ephron HaChiti was lower than it was once it's owned by Avram. It gets higher. So Vayakam, it got up and rose to a higher plane, which is a very beautiful idea. And we're going to talk around that idea later, but he's the only one who specifically talks about going from a lower level to a higher level in this kind of language. Rav Yoel Elitzur, who's a contemporary, as opposed to these scholars from the past, wrote, "We see from this that for the Torah, the purchase of the cave itself is not the main point." Now, the pasuk goes, I mean, it mentions Machpela, which is and the cave which is in the field, but it spends more time talking about everything else about the area around the field. Around the cave. We emphasize the field. So why is that? Because the cave itself is not the main point of the narrative here. Rather, it is the purchase of the field and all the trees anywhere within the confines of that field. That is the crux of the matter. What this means on a fundamental level is that Parshat Chaye Sarah is less concerned with Sarah's burial. I mean, it's the motivating factor that gets Avraham involved, but ultimately we're more concerned with something else, and more concerned with the story of the first formal acquisition of land in Eretz Yisrael by the very first, well, he uses the term Hebrew, Ivri, I would say Jew, but it doesn't make that much difference. Okay, so I'm going to skip toward a little bit. Okay, Avram faces the crowd at the beginning of which we didn't read about, when he comes and says he wants to buy a plot for his beloved wife. He addresses the people, and he says, "I am a resident alien among you. Ger v'toshav anochi." Toshav, I really live here, but I'm a ger. I'm an outsider. I'm not from you. This introduction is not simply a display of modesty. Rather, Avram is pointing out the frustration inherent in his current situation. "I have been living in your midst now for decades." For decades. Now she dies 127, he's 137. Now, the most Meforshim believe that they come to Eretz Yisrael when he's 75. So if that's true, then they've been there for, considerably more than half a century. I mean, they've really been there a while. I've been here in decades, but I'm still considered a resident alien. Avram continues, "Give me a burial site amongst you that I may remove my dead for burial." In other words, Avram is announcing that he will not bury Sarah until he has sold a burial site as an inheritance. And this goes back to the language that he originally used when he wanted to buy the plot. It must be achuzat kever. It's got to be a holding, a permanent holding. We are going to take a look at another comment that's going to mention that idea in just a few minutes. But this idea of purchasing land in Eretz Yisrael is very important. And it's very important. And there's almost an irony about this. And if you look at the famous Breshit Rabbah, the next item on your sheet, and it's a very famous idea. And like I said, it's famous, but it contains a very painful irony. And that is, Rav Yudin Bar Shimon used to say, "This is one of the three places that the nations of the world cannot deride Israel and say, they are stolen property in your hands. And these are the Cave of the Machpela in the middle of Hebron, which they've thrown us out of there." What's fascinating is from the time that the Muslims took control of it, end of the 1100s, until 1967. So we're talking about like 800 years, Jews were not allowed in Marat Machpelah. There were exceptions, and I'm going to tell a story about one of those exceptions in 1643. And there were other, once in a while, some Jew got in. I think there's a story about Moses Montefiore that got in, but he bribed somebody. But generally speaking, Jews were not allowed in Marat Machpelah for 800 years, give or take a couple. It's really tremendously ironic that this midrash, which was written sometime in the 4th century, made a prediction that clearly didn't come true, but okay. And so the first one is Martha Machpelah. The second one is the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount, which was bought by David HaMelech. It's fascinating. David HaMelech conquers Jerusalem from the Jebusites. And he goes to the king, Aravna, goes to the king of the Yevusi, and he says, I want to buy this piece of land, this plot of land at the top of the hill within Jerusalem. It probably wasn't within the city walls at that time, because most of the city was what today we call Ir David, on the lower slope, because that's where the water was. So it's possible that Ha Moriah, the Temple Mount, was not within the city limits. But he says, you know what? I want to buy it. I mean, it sounds crazy. He just conquered it. It's his by the right of conquest. But he says, no, I don't want anyone to ever question the possession of Har HaBayit, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I don't want anyone to ever question its ownership as being ours. Halavai, if only it were true. And the third is almost tragic. And the third one is Joseph's tomb, is Kever Yosef in Shechem, where there are Jews that visit this tomb. They have to go in military escort, and they go literally in the middle of the night. It's very rare that any trips are made to Kever Yosef during the daytime. And we know during the Second Intifada there was a terrible explosion there. The PA, the Palestinian Authority, blew it up, and they rebuilt it, and there were shibbutzim. But it's like the three places that we went out of our way to buy, and it was Yaakov Avinu after the famous incident with Dinah in Shechem, where he bought this piece of land in Shechem and he set it aside as a burial place for his beloved son Yosef. And after the Jews come back from Eretz Mitzrayim, they come back to Egypt, and Yosef is buried in Shechem. Historically, do we know the exact location? I doubt it. But this is the traditional location of the kever of Yosef. Now, these three locations, generally, two of them we really accept where they are. Marat Machpelah is the world's oldest building still in use. It was built by Herod 30 or 40 BCE, and no other building that was built by that time is still in use. The second oldest building is the Pantheon in Rome, which is about 120 years younger, but it's in better shape, actually. And Temple Mount, we know where it is because people have always been around there. Yosef's tomb, not so much. There are a few, many of our tomb identifications are iffy, to say the least. And that's true of Yosef. It's true of Rachel. It's true of the Navi, Shmuel, Navi. There are a couple of places claimed to be his burial space. However, these two places, Har HaBayit and Marat Machpelah, those we really, really know exactly where they are. And theoretically, no one should question our ownership. The irony is that those are three of the most debated and fought pieces of real estate in the world. The present war in Gaza, ostensibly, they did it because they did it. They're Rishayim, they're evil people. That's not they don't need an excuse. But the excuse that they gave for starting this war and for committing those atrocities on Shmini Atzeret, Simchat Torah, was it has to do with protecting the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which of course is ridiculous. Even if there was an incident there that they didn't like, that's so unusual. I mean, when we conquered the city in 1967, Moshe Dayan, you can say he was right or he was wrong. That's not the point. But he immediately gave back the keys to the Temple Mount to the Arab authorities. They, even though our police maintain order there, but they're the ones in charge of what's going on up there. I mean, we couldn't have been nicer to them, but nice doesn't get you very much here in our present situation. So anyways, so these three locations were paid for in cash by our great ancestors, Avraham, Yaakov, and David HaMelech, and therefore no one should ever question our communal national ownership of these locations. However, the world does not pay attention. The world does not pay attention. So I'm going to do now a second comment by the Or HaChaim about this material. And we'd already seen him before talk about how the location was raised, but he makes a totally different point over here. Avram made a point of describing the transaction as a gift, which is interesting because he says, tenly, give me. It's a gift, even though he's going to pay a lot of money for this piece of property. So why is it a gift? Even though he was perfectly aware that money would be changing hands, he's going to pay, and apparently pay through the nose. He's going to pay a lot of money, much more than the property was worth, as indicated by the words for full monetary value, kesev maleh. Okay, Avraham was astute enough to purchase the cave in such a way that any future complaint was out of the question. In other words, not only is he paying for it, but the other side was giving it freely. There was no coercion, and there couldn't later be a claim, oh, we didn't know how wonderful this place was going to be. He tricked us. No. In other words, they gave it freely, and we paid excessive amount to make sure that no one could ever question, okay, that any future complaint was out of the question. He was also careful to add the words in your midst, amongst you, right? The Zohar points out that Ephron never saw anything in that cave except darkness and calamity. This brings up another fascinating point. Ephron never knew how special this location is. Now, I don't know how special it was before Sarah was buried there. We know how special it is now, but the Zohar and the tradition is that Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, were buried there as well. And that when we went there, we saw, wow, something special is happening here. Okay, this is the entrance way to Gan Eden, to paradise. But what's fascinating is the Gentiles never noticed something special about this location. The Midrash goes on, or the Midrash in the Zohar really, goes on to say that it was the burial of the Avot there that attained Olam Haba and Tchiyat HaMetim for Adam and Chava. Adam and Chava were like dead and non-existent until they were joined by the patriarchs and matriarchs, and then they joined them in Gan Eden, the heavenly one. But this idea that Eretz Yisrael is different when the Jews aren't here is a fascinating and powerful idea. We know that from writings of people in the 12th century, Benjamin of Tudela, from writings of some crusaders in the same century, that Eretz Yisrael was really a difficult land, that there wasn't enough water, there wasn't enough food, nothing worked. It was a tough place to live. And as recently as the middle of the 19th century, Mark Twain wrote about coming to Eretz Yisrael, and he lived in Yerushalayim for about a year. He was the secretary to the American consul just inside Shar Yafo in the old city, and he lived there for over a year. And while he was traveling from Yafo, the only port in those days, to Yerushalayim, straight from Yafo to Shar Yafo, he said the only living thing he saw between Yafo and Yerushalayim was a donkey, that it was empty. And we know that, the country doesn't produce, the country isn't special when the Jews aren't here. It's just a fascinating phenomenon that when Jews are here, whether in the time of David or later in the time even of Herod and the Maccabees, the country was a cool place to live. But from the Bar Kokhba rebellion, basically, until when the Jews start coming back at the end of the 19th century, because the earlier Jews that came weren't so interested in agriculture. They were more interested, in the spiritual nature of the Yishuv HaYashan, the older settlements. But by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, we're planting vineyards and we're planting all sorts of crops. And now we've become, a garden. It's a beautiful location. And it's only a beautiful location when the Jews are here, because only the Jews truly notice what's special about this land. And that was already noted in the time of Avraham Avinu. Now I want to tell one quick story. It's not a terrific story, but I just find it fascinating that there was in 1643 a visit here from a pasha, one of the machers, one of the important officials from Istanbul. And in his party was Rav Avraham Azulai, who's known as the Chesed Avram. He was not only a court official, but he was a Talmud Chacham, and he wrote Sfarim, and he jumped apparently at the opportunity to go from Istanbul to Eretz Yisrael. And this Pasha, this important personality, visits Marta Machpela, and there was a hole in the pavement, the paved ground in the cave, in the building, and you can look down, or you could, now it's been closed up, you could look down into the cave where the actual kuchim, the actual funeral niches are in the wall, where the sarcophagi, the caskets of the Avot were placed. And he was the first witness that we know of that said that there were 6. I know the Zohar says that Adam and Chava are there, but we're not worried about that. There are 6, and that's where the Avot and Imahot were. So what happens is this important official leans over, and his sword falls into the cave. And that sword was given to him by the Sultan in Istanbul, and it was the handle was gold, and and on the blade were precious stones. It was very, very valuable, and he was, I think, probably a little bit afraid to go back to Istanbul without this gift given to him by the Sultan. So they started dropping ropes down there and trying to retrieve it. No one could do it. So they said somebody has to go into the cave. So they did lots. They drew lots. Who's going to go into the cave? And obviously, I wouldn't be telling the story if it wasn't the Jew, if it wasn't the Chesed LaAvraham, Rabbi Avraham Azulai, who was appointed to go in, and he's very nervous, and he writes in his memoirs and letters that he sent to people that he went to mikveh, and he wore white like tachrichim, and he said tehillim, and he didn't sleep the entire night before he was going in the morning. He goes in the morning, and he sees the 6 kuchim, and he finds the sword, and he picks up the sword, and he comes back, and he said he was never the same after that. That he was like spiritually enlightened by this visit into the cave, and he felt the aura, the kedusha of the Avot and Imahot. And I want you to know there's something very special about Marta Machpela. Rivka sitting here with me, and we talk about it sometimes. I often go to the room that's theoretically above the graves of Yaakov and Leah. Those were my parents' names, and I would just find it very special to just sit there, say some Tehillim, and just think. And it's always very, very moving, and it was very wonderful that the grandson that I share with Gail Brannon had his bris in Martha Machpelah, and I mean it was just I was the Sandik. Sorry, Norman, you'll get the next one. But it was very moving. Just thinking about it, I sort of feel like crying. It's such a special place, and the special place happened then. It became something special then, and that's what's going on. And I want to just go to. I have on the sheet T. I'm sorry. Yeah, we're going to take that for 1 second. So on the sheet, it's a little bit out of order. I want to go to the 4 psukim that I have just before the bottom on the back side of the sheet, because a fascinating thing happens here in this chapter 23. In verses 3, 7, 17, and the final verse of the chapter, verse 20, each of those 4 verses begins with the word vayakam. And it arose, or he arose. The first two are he arose. Vayakam Avraham. Avraham got up from before his corpse, his wife's body, his mate, his dead beloved wife. He rises from that to do what he has to do. In other words, he's down in the dumps and he arises. So we're talking about the word somehow arising, right? Then in verse 7, again, Avraham, vayakam Avraham, vayishtachu la'am ha'aretz livnei chet. Avraham again, first time he gets up from, I don't want to say Shiva, but from his being an onain, from his being really depressed over the death of his beloved wife. And now he gets up to raise himself up before the crowd. He rises before the important personalities of the city of Hebron, and he bows to them. And then he makes his offer. The second 2 times that this word comes up is not Avraham vayakam. Vayakam Sedei Ephron, Vayakam Hasadeh V'Hama'orah. Avraham rose to the occasion twice, and now the field rises to the occasion. So it's clear if one word starts off 4 different psukim in a short 20-verse area, clearly that word means something very, very important. And so I noticed that one midrash referred us to a pasuk that describes the word vayakam. And that verse is a little bit higher on your sheet. That verse is in Yeshayahu. And it tells us something about what it means, lakum, to rise up. V'nadiv nedivut ya'atz. But the noble has noble intentions. Nadiv is a word that we use for people that are very generous, philanthropic. That was the name, that was the nickname, the secret name of Baron Rothschild here in Eretz Yisrael, because he wanted to make all of his donations, as opposed to Montefiore, who traveled around and distributed his own money a little bit earlier than Baron Rothschild. Baron Rothschild, when he only came a couple of times. He's buried here, but he only, he would want to stay in the background. And so they came up with a slang term for who he was, who the anonymous donor was. And the term they came up with was the nadiv, the benefactor, the philanthropist. It's a beautiful term. So nadiv, nadivut ya'atz. Nobility is the translation I have in front of me, but it means a person who is giving and generous and kind and considerate. He has ya'atz. He has noble intentions. V'hu al nidivut yakum. It's because of these constant acts of nobility, of generousness, generosity, that he yakum. In other words, to rise has to do with nobility, with being noble, with being special, with being kind, with having traits that others admire. So what happens is, in our pasukim, in our perek, first we see that Avraham rose and was seen as somebody special by the people, and then the field rises, and the field becomes something special in the eyes of everybody. And to this day, it's a very special place. It has a certain aura to it, and it's felt both by us and by our Arab neighbors. And I hope that things stay relatively quiet in Hebron during these difficult times. We've come up with a bit of a modus vivendi, a way of life down there. We share the location. Half of it is always open to Jews, and half of it is always open to Arabs. Different entrances and exits, but there are 11 days a year for both groups where it's exclusively to them. And Rivka and I were there about 2 years ago on Chol HaMoed Sukkot, and it was just wonderful to go to the places that we normally can't visit there. But it arose because people felt the spirituality, the nobility of the location. And so, I mean, that's what's really going on in our verses. Avraham rose to a new level once he becomes a landowner in Eretz Yisrael, and the land rose to a higher level once it's owned by a Jew. The special nature of Eretz Yisrael comes from us. We hear all of these chants of our enemies, that we have no place here. I mean, it's so ridiculous. You read our psukim and you read Tanakh, we have no place here. I mean, it's all about us. The land in us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, B'nai Yisrael, and Eretz Yisrael, Echad. We're just one. We just form a unity. There's no question about it. The land responds to our presence. It's just so. It's so remarkable. We can always point out, there aren't enough times to point out the fact that the name Yerushalayim is in Tanakh 664 times, and in the Koran it doesn't appear. So it's like, what's wrong with this picture? What do we understand that the rest of the world, supposedly smart people at Ivy League universities, what is it that they don't get? If they just, study a tiny bit of the history of Eretz Yisrael. But in our psukim, we're not only talking about the historical, literary, spiritual, social connection, we're also talking about we bought it. I mean, we have the contract written out in front of us. The Bible is the most bought and possessed book in the world. You'd think that someone would look at it and say, "Hi, well, I think the Jews do seem to have some claim to this." But okay, it is what it is. But it's just when you read these psukim, it's just it just should overcome us with this feeling of close connection to Eretz Yisrael. And I want to end with the words of the Netivot Shalom. The Netivot Shalom is the Slonim Rebbe. The Slonim Rebbe, who was just a very special individual. He died in 2000, but he didn't listen to his uncle, who was the Slonim Rebbe before him. And in the early 1930s, he ran away from home just after his bar mitzvah. He runs away from home in Slonim in Europe, in Eastern Europe, to Yerushalayim. And he just lived the rest of his life in Yerushalayim. And of course, most of the Slonim Hasidim, including his uncle, the Rebbe, were massacred and killed in the Holocaust. And the few survivors come to Yerushalayim and make him the Slonim Rebbe, which he was until he died. He was very special, and people have heard me talk about him before. It was just wonderful to go on Thursdays to hear him speak, and to see. I mean, most of the room was filled with black hats and black kapatas and everything. But there were always a certain number of people in white shirts or blue shirts and knit yarmulkes, and he was always welcoming and gracious, even though the base medrash, now it's much bigger, then it was a much smaller building on the edge of Mea Sharim, and it was just wonderful. He was always, I never had the nerve to actually ask a question, but I would go up and listen. And he was just so kind and gracious to everyone. I regret being a coward over this. But he also wants to talk about Vayakam, the idea of everything is about rising up to a higher spiritual plane. Okay, if we look more deeply into the matter, this is my translation. Most of the other things on the page were translated on Safari, but this is mine. If it's not as eloquent, I apologize. If we look more deeply into the matter, we will see that land owned by Gentiles are immersed in Tumah. That's especially here in Eretz Yisrael. Now, in Eretz Yisrael, you buy land, you grow things, you take trumot and mahasot, you keep shemitah. And as we do things to try to give some tahara, some holiness, some purity to the land. And Gentiles don't. I don't think he means it in a terribly negative way. In order to remove that tumah and make it Jewish, a Jew must fully purchase that land with recognized assets. Over l'socher was the terminology in the text. In other words, there can't be any question about the validity of the sale because we paid money that's over l'socher. Everybody recognized as legitimate funds, kesef malay, and we paid more than market value. Avram didn't want to bury his beloved in a plot still connected to Tumah. Notice he's saying that he wanted this plot, first and foremost, for a special place for his wife. That's why the text emphasizes achuzat kever. He didn't want, they had said to him right away, oh, we'll give you a funeral plot in our cemetery. He didn't want that. He wanted an achuzah. He wanted a holding, ochez, that would be held firm by the Jewish people forever. Achuzat kever. I didn't want to be buried in your cemetery. And by the way, this has given us the minhag that, generally speaking, we try to have our own cemetery separate from others. I always found it jarring that sometimes you see in military cemeteries, sometimes like pictures in France. I remember at the end of Saving Private Ryan that you see the massive military cemetery in Normandy, and amongst the crosses were a few Jewish stars. I always find, I understand why Steven Spielberg wanted to film it there, but I find it jarring because that's not the minhag. We want our own, our own achuzat kever, and that is generally the rule. Okay. He also wanted to fulfill the verse, "He who spurns gifts will live long." Famous pasuk from Mishlei, from Proverbs, advice from Shlomo HaMelech, the wisest man who ever lived. And so the Malbim comments on that, says, doesn't want to benefit from the possessions of others. I don't want to, I want it to be mine. I'm going to pay full price. It's going to be mine. I don't want anyone to say, I made Avraham. I mean, we said that back when he met with the king of Sodom. He wanted to give him things. He said, no. You take what you want, and I have nothing to do with you. I don't want you to claim that you made me a wealthy man. Okay? So we spurn gifts. We will live a long time. And that long life is not only in this world, but is in the world to come as well. That is what the sages meant when they said that the Avot kept the whole Torah before it was given. This is an idea in next week's Torah reading in Parshat Toldot, when it says that the Avot kept all of the Chukim, and the Midrash says that the Jews, the Avot kept the Torah through some sort of nevuah. That's not what the Rebbe is saying. They endeavored to always do what was yashar, upright in the eyes of Hashem. That we did what the Torah would have wanted, or they did what the Torah would have wanted through a shikul hadat. They thought about it and they just knew what the right thing would do. They intuited the kind of sacred, holy, upright behavior. That's what the Torah wants from us. As the Torah doesn't want us, to become crazy over details of halacha. I have to be careful. I'm saying this from my wife who thinks, but you do that. That's not what it's about. It's not about the minutiae of halacha. It's about, or minusha. It's about doing what is upright and correct. And that we see in the behavior of Avraham Avinu. He didn't have to be given the Torah. He did it through a shikul hadat. He did it through just using his logic and using his tremendous powers of observation and ability to know what is right and good. And that's who Avraham was. And that's what we're supposed to do as well. And it's hard not to think about a lot of these issues as we're fighting this war. Number one, it's our land. I mean, we gave them Gaza. I mean, it's like no matter what we give them, there's never enough. Okay, because they just deny our right to be here. Bichlal. Okay, that's number one. And number two, we have a shikul hadat. We have a well thought out method of deciding both reasonably, logically, ethically what must has to be done. That's why, Jews aren't going around the streets of Gaza City and ripping off heads and raping women. It's just, yes, they were upset with some of the things that we're doing, but we have no choice. It's a shikul hadat. We're warning you. We're coming. Please do what you can to save yourselves, because we have to do what we have to do. Everything's done with the shikul hadat. It's so amazing that what's happening right now, just an hour and a half drive from here, is exactly the issues that I've been talking about in this week's parsha. The most important is we took the land, we paid for it, we made it ours, And we just want to live here. And we have, off and on, forever. There have always been Jews in Eretz Yisrael since the time of Yeshua. There were times in the Middle Ages when the numbers were very small, but there were always Jews in Eretz Yisrael from Yeshua till today and Ad Olam forever. That's point number one. And point number two is we really try to make our behavior and our decisions through truly shikul hadat, sitting down and thinking through the issues. It's not like acting like crazy people. It's got to be done in a logical, in a well thought out methodological purpose. And Be'ezrat Hashem, with that help and the siyata d'shmaya, we will succeed quickly and as painlessly as possible in this present endeavor of just uprooting evil in the land. We want to take Eretz Yisrael, including Gaza, and get rid of the tumah, remove the impurities, and just make things much more tahor, much more pure, much more clean, much more reasonable. And hopefully, with brachot from Hashem, we'll accomplish this quickly and again, as painlessly as possible. Thank you. Good night, Gene. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.